Another change in the schedule, I'd now like to invite the Federal Opposition Leader, Peter Dutton, to join the stage with me for an in-conversation about regional Australia. Please welcome him. So, Peter, this is your first Bush Summit, I believe. Not on your own part. I don't think we've ever had occasion to invite you before. You've occupied portfolios that often exist far from the regions, but now as leader of the federal coalition, obviously we are very keen to get your perspective on regional Australia. You've obviously also shifted from nearly a decade in government to being in opposition. So to start with, I'd really like to know how you see it, what your role is in opposition advocating for the bush and for the regions.
Well, thanks for rubbing that in, Claire. It's
Sorry.
It's not fun every day to be in opposition, but the opportunity for us is to really reimagine some of the policies, first point, obviously to hold the government to account. I think we're doing that in relation to a number of issues around cost of living and the voice, etc. at the moment. But the true time in opposition is to re-engage with Australians, with stakeholders. When you're a minister, as Defence Minister, you're racing from one issue to the next and dealing with the departmental requirements and visiting bases and making decisions, negotiating AUKUS, all of that. When you get into opposition...
Just casually negotiating AUKUS.
That's right. But when you get into opposition, you have time again to be able to have a longer conversation, and I think that's the benefit of being here today, but the more general engagement that we have across portfolios and across the country.
And speaking of opposition, I'm sure you noticed as you came into the building this morning, we've got quite a protest outside. This issue of, the burden perhaps that the bush is bearing in this energy transition, this issue of planning and consultation over things like transmission lines is obviously something that has got this community very engaged and they care very deeply about it. What's your position?
Well, my view is, and this is why we've started the debate in relation to the small modular reactors, as Bill Gates and others point out, we should be trying per square metre to get the maximum yield of energy out of that footprint. And if we're rolling out turbines across regional areas, it comes with transmission wires and the cost that local communities have to pay. Now, I live on a small rural property, but 35, 40 minutes out of the city in Brisbane. People in my community wouldn't tolerate turbines going up in their suburbs. Pure and simple. They want an amenity, and I think there is a divide now between cities and regional areas where people in regional areas are being treated as second-class citizens. I think people want amenity in their own communities. They want to contribute to the national energy debate and task. That's fine. But I think there's a lot of work that we could do if we moved away from wind turbines onshore into small-scale modular reactors, which can firm up the renewables in the system. I think the government's got us at the moment on a pathway to disruption of energy supply, and far from a $275 reduction in electricity prices, people are now getting double-digit increases in their electricity and gas bills on a quarterly basis. I don't think it's sustainable, and I think it's why we need to have an honest discussion, and I am against the creation of havoc and pain within rural communities. I think Australians need to be treated equally, and rolling out 28,000 kilometres of poles and wires, as the government is proposing, is not only incredibly expensive, it's not the most efficient way of spending taxpayers' money.
We've seen in the community, obviously, the concern about the construction of those types of renewables. Do you think the community is prepared to host a small modular reactor within their midst?
I think if you look at what now 50 countries are doing, looking at small modular reactors, 32 countries who are involved in the latest technology of nuclear, it allows you through the micro-modular reactor or through the small modular reactor that countries like France and the United States, China, the UK, other countries in Europe are now investigating. It gives you the opportunity to open up irrigation, to provide support into a community so that where you've got a retiring asset, a retiring coal-fired generation asset, for example, it gives you the ability to plug and play into an existing distribution network. It means that you don't have the capital requirement for the 28,000 kilometres of poles and wires through prime farming land, through national parks, and it allows you to reduce emissions, no emissions from nuclear technology, and final point is it's exactly the same technology that's going to be deployed on the submarines that the government has now ordered. So the irony is that the submarine technology now means that the submarine can traverse the world for 30 years. It doesn't need to be refuelled. We can deal with the waste responsibly, and you don't have the disruption to rural communities that we're seeing unfold at the moment.
To another issue that's been all over the headlines these past week, China has removed its tariffs on Australian barley. Good news for farmers in this region and beyond. Do you think that that move is an endorsement of the way the government has approached its relationship with China, or was it a matter of a passage of time to be able to get a result like this?
Well, it's a good outcome for farmers, and we welcome that. I think it's also a good outcome, frankly, that many manufacturers, producers, people who are worried about supply chain sureties are now diversifying into different markets as well. I think there was too heavy a reliance within that market. There's obviously a good margin, very significant critical mass and big scale, but I think a lot of astute operators are now diversifying elsewhere, and not just Australian companies, but companies from our region, from North America, from Europe, elsewhere, are looking at ways in which they can de-risk, because as Australia's ambassador to the United States, Kevin Rudd, pointed out in the last 24 hours, we live in a very difficult time, and if there is to be a disruption, naval blockades in our region over the course of the next decade or two, we need to be careful about how much exposure we have to that. So ultimately our national security is the most important priority for our country, to keep our people safe. But economically, we want the relationship with China to expand as an export market and take the opportunity to grow Australian industry as a result of that. But need to be realistic about the conditions that we're facing, and not just the Americans pointing that out, but now NATO and others in Europe who are worried about what they're seeing in the Indo-Pacific.
And a little closer to home, an issue we've heard a lot about so far, and will continue, I think, at this Bush Summit to hear about, is livability in the bush, particularly pressures on housing. And if I could join that perhaps with, obviously, the need to get labour and a workforce into our regions, which further puts pressure on housing. What's going wrong, and what are you focusing on in terms of how to maybe come up with solutions for this very difficult problem?
Well, it's a good question, Claire. I mean, clearly there are supply-side issues. In government, we provided a lot of support to first home buyers. We provide access to superannuation for young first home buyers so that they could get the deposit that was needed to actually enter the housing market. Now, all of those measures have fuelled demand, and at the same time, the government's announcing that they're going to bring in, through the migration program, about 1.5 million people over the course of the next 5 years or so. That's a population bigger than the city of Adelaide, and at the moment we've got Australians lined up in queues to try and rent a property. People can't buy a house at auction for love nor money, and I think if you're fuelling the demand, as the government is through the migration program, then that's going to put more pressure on housing stock here. So migration is a good thing for our country, particularly where in regional areas people can't find the labour for abattoirs or for agricultural production and harvesting, etc. So we need to be realistic about our needs, but equally you need to have a plan for additional supply coming into the housing market, because if not, we end up in the position that we are today, if not worse, over the course of the next 5 years.
So if the government does address some of those issues, could they potentially count on coalition support in the Parliament to get that through?
Well, the bill that's before the Parliament at the moment is in relation to social housing. So the question more generally about housing, I think, rests with state and local governments, because that's where the planning laws are enacted and where they're enforced. Obviously, the Premier in New South Wales is talking about liberating some areas. I think the other element that we need to be very conscious of is that the infrastructure just hasn't kept up with housing particularly in peri-urban areas where you've got roads that are already beyond capacity when the ribbons are cut, and you've got schools that are already full and public transport networks that are beyond capacity. So there is a whole lot of planning that needs to go with it. And you were talking before about water security and water supply. Those fundamentals, electricity and the energy needs for not just the households, but the businesses, the industry that needs to go with it to employ people in local areas, that work has to be more effective than what it has been in the past. And I just fear that there's a very significant divide between the three levels of government, and there's not the level of coordination that we need.
Well, thank you. Right on the dot. So I'm going to end it there. But thanks so much, Peter Dutton, Leader of the Federal Opposition. Thanks for speaking with us.
Pleasure. Thanks, Claire. Thank you.